really good question given to me recently. It was about how to share your faith in the workplace. In the church, we often talk about and encourage people who follow Jesus to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with anybody that'll be willing to listen. But when you're in the workplace, in a secular environment, it's not always conducive or easy to share your faith. And so this person had a question, how do you do that? Well, I want to give you 2 little tips that might help you as you try to share your faith in a workplace where most of the people are not believers in Jesus Christ. One of those is you're going to watch to see where God is at work. Now, Jesus said something very interesting in John chapter 5, and I want to read that. It's in verse 17. And this is what Jesus said about His heavenly Father. Jesus responded to them, "My Father is still working, and I am working also." Henry Blackaby, about 25 years ago, wrote a study called Experiencing God, and one of the principles that he talked about in the Experiencing God study is that God is always at work, and our job is not to manufacture opportunities to do the work of God. Our job is to look around and see where God is at work and then go join Him. And I think that's really what Jesus is saying in John chapter 5, verse 17. He says, "My Father is always working." And what Jesus was doing was going to where the Father was already at work, and He was joining Him in that work. So when you're in your workplace, you might want to look around and even pray for God to give you spiritual vision to see where He's at work. There's probably someone that you're working with or beside or maybe down the line, and that person's going through a life crisis, and you can tell because God is at work in that person's life through the life crisis. And maybe through that experience, as they share about the life crisis, you will have an opportunity to share how your faith has been shaped for crisis moments by Jesus. And by doing that, you're going to be able to share the gospel. And so be sure to always be watching for where God is at work. You're not going to have to manufacture the opportunities to share the gospel as much as you are to look for the places where God's already at work and then bring the gospel to those locations. The second principle is to look around at places where there are common areas of interest where the gospel can be brought to bear. Now, what do I mean by that? Let me go to Acts chapter 17. And when we get to Acts chapter 17, we find that Paul is in Athens. And as he's walking through the city, he notices that the city is filled with idols. This lets him know that the people already have some sense of a spiritual desire in their hearts, because as they're worshiping the idols, they're trying to fulfill something that is already in their hearts related to worship. And what does Paul do? He simply uses that common ground of people wanting to worship something to introduce the gospel. This is how it's recorded for us in Acts chapter 17, verse 16. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed when he saw that the city was full of idols. This let him know the people had a desire to worship something. Unfortunately, though, in Athens, they were worshiping the wrong thing. So what does Paul do? In verse 17 of Acts chapter 17, it says, "So he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with those who worshiped God, as well as in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there." Paul took something that was common ground. The people had a desire to worship. They just had it turned in the wrong direction, and he introduced Jesus. Look for some common ground in your workplace. What are some things that you have in common with other people, but in their case, they've turned their affections and their devotions in the wrong direction, and you have the opportunity to come alongside of them and introduce them to the right direction and the right devotion, and that would be to Jesus. Well, those are my 2 encouragements to answer this question. How do you share the gospel in the workplace? Look for where God's at work, and then look for the common ground. And in both instances, bring the gospel to those 2 locations. And I think you'll be successful in making a gospel difference in your workplace.